Hello, and welcome to another episode of Reality Writes. I am author Ellie Alexander. This is the podcast where we talk about all things writerish, bookish, whatever else is on our mind, and we try to take you behind the scenes of the writing life and what goes into the process of sending books out into the world. And I am here today with the tech guy.
Hello. Yeah, today we're covering some more writerish topics, all about process, right?
All about process, but I think for any darlings who are readers and don't necessarily think of themselves as writers or, think like, oh, this podcast might not be for me. I believe that you will appreciate this because we're really going to give you a look behind the scenes at my writing process over the years, how it shifted, how it hasn't shifted, and break down what it looks like for every book that I write.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the things that we get comments on the podcast all the time is that even though this is a podcast about writing and a podcast about reading, the topics we cover tend to be of interest to both because, as you said many times, if you want to be a great writer, you have to be a reader.
It's true. And I think from the reading aspect, having been a lifelong reader myself, I'm always fascinated about the behind the scenes of writing too, how the book that you're holding in your hands goes from the seed of an idea to actually being in print or audio or ebook.
Yeah, I can say without a doubt that I was blown away when I learned the entire process and, have experienced it both through traditional publishing and then also the indie route that we've done a few books ourselves together. And it is a monster amount of work. And the number of people that touch the books still boggles my mind to this day.
I actually love the process. The process of writing is my favorite part. And this is another thing that I've been talking about a lot lately in the age of AI. If you take away that part of the process, you lose all of that creative energy, which is such a gift because even though I do so much plotting and planning before I start writing every book, I never exactly know where it's going to take me, which is such a gift because if I'm surprised, then you darlings are hopefully definitely surprised when there's a twist or a character who I did not think was going to be the killer that decides somewhere, like a third of the way through the book that actually, you know what? You should probably be keeping your eye on me, Ellie.
Yeah, totally. So today we're going to talk about process, right?
That's right.
Yeah. See what I did there? We're talking about the writing process. I said process, right?
Oh, no. But I'm dumb.
Yeah. We've come up with the greatest puns here on Reality Writes. Well, and as you've said, one of the main things that you concentrate on when it comes to process is word count. So it all starts with that, right?
Word count is queen in my book, to extend the pun. And then I'm sorry, darlings, we'll try to stop with that. So yes, I was recently reflecting in terms of how my word count has changed and evolved over the years, because I've been writing for nearly 2 decades now. And I also have changed and upped my word count goals over the years. So for any darlings who might be new to word count, I'm a big believer in setting a word count goal for your writing versus just, maybe saying like, oh, I'll write for 2 hours today or I'll write for 30 minutes, because you can spend that time. And I know I sound like a broken record to some of you who've been OG listeners to this podcast or other things that I've put out there, but you can spend 2 hours and end up with nothing on a page. But if you set yourself a word count goal, then at the end of whatever time you've set aside to achieve that goal, you should have that number of words, whether it's 10 or 10,000 on the page. And so when I was first writing my very first mystery series, this was year one. We'll call it year one. This was long before I had a book contract. This was long before I had an agent. I just had the start of an idea. And I was working a different job. And I also had our son at home who was in kindergarten at the time. And so I had a very limited amount of time to write. And so I knew I needed to set myself a goal so that 5 days a week while I was not working my other job or we had our kiddo at home, I would have that chunk of time for writing. So my goal for year one was 250 words. And when I first started writing, that seemed like a lot of words. Let me tell you, it was like, oh my gosh, I have to write 250 words 5 days a week. But if you break it down like that, I'm always working toward a completed first draft. And in that completed first draft, we're just talking about a draft. These words don't necessarily have to be pretty. The goal is to get the story onto the page.
Yeah, and that's something that you talk about in your course, the Mystery Series Masterclass too, is just the number of words, because you talk a lot about the number of words you write now per day. But that has changed over the years and obviously didn't start there, like you said. So I think that's a really important point for, especially for new writers out there to understand, is that it's all about developing that muscle and learning, like getting into the habit of writing. I'm going to write 200 words a day. I'm going to write 400 words a day. I'm going to write, and repeating that and growing that over time as it gets easier and easier to write that number of words, rather than trying to sit down and say, I'm going to write 2,500 words today, and realizing 300 words in, that's a lot of words.
Yeah. And then you're setting yourself up for failure too. And it becomes a self fulfilling prophecy because you're like, oh, okay, I can't do this. Whereas if you set something that's really manageable, it could be 50 words a day, it could be 100 words a day. It doesn't have to be a lot, but you start to chip away at that goal of trying to get to like 50 or 60,000 words as a first draft. Remember, darlings, especially any writers who are listening, we're talking about a first draft, which is just a draft. Okay, so then 250 words was my goal the first year of writing. And then years 2 to 3, this is again before I have an agent, an editor, a book contract. I am still learning the process for myself, which, as an aside, I know I've said this before too, but I think it's always worth repeating. You have to find your own process and what works for you. You can't have anyone else necessarily dictate exactly what is going to work for you, myself included. You might say, like, okay, Ellie, I've tried word count, and for whatever reason, that doesn't work for me. That's fine. Like, figure out what works for you. Okay, so in years 2 to 3, this is pre-book deal again, I was writing 500 words a day. And part of the reason I was writing 500 days, part of the reason I was writing 500 words a day, again, taking the weekends off, so this is Monday through Friday, is that I had started developing a little bit of muscle memory. So it was getting slightly easier. The first year, when 250 words felt like a stretch, the second and third years, I was like, oh, wait, I can go a little bit more. Oh, this is coming easier. I'm starting to learn the flow and the rhythm of my time. I think I can push myself to 500 words. And it worked.
When do you know that it's time to make that swap, like, or to make
Ooh.
that change? Like,
Yeah, that's a great
you know,
question. I think that, like, once it starts to feel like it's coming easy, like if you're hitting that 250 words or whatever goal you've set for yourself, and you're hitting that within, a half hour or an hour of your writing time, or it's just you are feeling like, oh, this rhythm is working for me. Now, maybe that becomes your long-term process too, which is fine. But for me, I knew I had a goal of wanting to write multiple series. And so I was just learning and trying so many things out at that point in time too, some of which was working and a lot of it wasn't either. And that's, again, part of the process.
once you make that change, then is it okay to go back? If you, let's say you're writing 250 words a day, you make the change and you say, okay, now I'm going to start writing 500 words a day, but 500 words seems like too much. Is it okay to dial it down?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Again, like, I think it's so important that you feel empowered to set your own goals and figure out what works for you and not feel the pressure of a word count goal, even if it's something that you're setting for yourself. I mean, I always like a good stretch goal because it does help motivate me. But if it's something where you're like, oh my gosh, I've gone way too far. Yes, backtrack and go back to the sweet spot that is working for you.
Awesome. Okay, so now you're at 500 words. Is this
We
this phase
are
you're at?
at 500 words for years 2 to
Okay.
3. Year 4, this is all of writing my first mysteries too. I should categorize that because before I started writing mysteries, the very first book that I wrote was a memoir. So I had already spent 5 years before this point in time learning the craft of writing a memoir. So I was coming into writing a mystery with like some baseline. Okay, year 4, I have signed my first 2 book contracts. And the way that it happened for me is really quickly right out of the gate. My agent sold one series, and then a few months later, he sold a second series. So from the time I launched my professional mystery writing career, I was writing 2 different mystery series for 2 different publishing houses, which was so exciting, completely overwhelming. I was still figuring out what I was doing. So I immediately bumped my daily word count goal up to 1,000 words a day because I was like, oh gosh, okay, we're in it now. Now we're cooking with gas.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember that happening and remember you talking when we'd be out to dinner with friends or whatever, and you would, drop the fact that you're writing 1,000 words a day. And that got into like, some surprised reactions of like, how could you possibly write 1,000 words a day? And then it became like, this is your job, right? This is what you're doing. And so you're sitting down and you're accomplishing this every day. But that's year 4. Where did it go from there?
Year 4, 1,000 words a day. And then year 5, I was like, you know what? I'm writing multiple series now. I'm publishing 4 to 5 books a year from the get-go, which is not always the case, right? You might spend the first couple years of your career publishing one book because the way that the publishing houses work, especially with Cozy Mysteries, things were coming out like every 6 months, some every 4 to 6 months. So I was like, all right, we have to go up to 2,000 words a day. So from year 5 to year 12, actually, it was 2,000 words a day, 5 days a week, writing multiple mystery series. And that really was my rhythm for a big chunk of time then, from years 5 to 12, 2,000 words every day.
And explain for the darlings too, though, the time factor, right? Because you weren't writing 2,000 words in the same time it took you to write 500 words or 250 words necessarily, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. Yes. Again, because I now have developed some muscle memory, I'm starting to really sink into how I'm getting to those cliffhangers, twists. That starts to just become secondary. It's like you or any other career path, right? Once you've worked at a job for a while, you become more proficient and then you work your way up to expert level. And that carries across over every profession, I think. It's not just unique to writing, but I think because writing is a creative endeavor, it feels more whimsical or ethereal or mystical versus the goal here with this podcast and everything that I try to put out there is like, no, it's tangible. Like, it's a real job.
Yeah, it's an output. For any job, no matter what you're doing, you go to work for a certain number of hours a day and you have an output that you create. And, whether that's number of customers served, do you want fries with that? Or all the way up to, I don't know, building rockets. Hopefully they're not building more than one rocket in a day, but you never know.
You never know.
You don't know what the process is like these days, I guess. All right, so that's through year 12. What happened next?
Year 13, we took another turn because year 13 was the point at which I started writing in multiple genres. So I dipped a pinky toe into writing my first cozy rom-com and my first, I'm going to call it cozy fantasy, which was Lost Coast Literary. And so at that point in time, writing multiple genres, as well as still writing multiple series, I bumped my daily word count up to 3,000 words. And I have been at 3,000 words a day from that point on until today. Still 3,000 words.
It's amazing. I mean, that's, quick math. That's 15,000 words a week, 60,000 words a month. Incredible. From a non-writer's perspective, that just seems amazing. But again, going back to the whole thing of like it being an output, and you said it right. It took you time to get here to this level. You've built that muscle, you built that expertise, and now you're using it to up your output based on the number of series you're writing, the number of books you're writing, the number of publishers you're writing for. Um, those all of that kind of built upon itself to get to this level.
Exactly, right? I didn't start out at 3,000 words a day. I started out at 250 words a day over 15 years ago. And so it's been a long, slow process and those like step ups each time. And to circle back to your other point, I'm still using the same chunk of writing time each day to write 3,000 words. But again, I have this whole breadth of experience and history behind me that allows me to do that. And so now I really can write a pretty terrible first draft, or I would say actually my first drafts have gotten a lot better over time too, especially if it's a book or a series that I'm really familiar with the world, like the Bake Shop Mysteries. I don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about what Lance is going to say when he comes onto the scene, things like that.
Right. Yeah, you're pretty familiar with those characters by this point. 24 or 5 books in, yeah.
Exactly. But I'm not spending, 12 hours a day to get to 3,000 words. That is just it's in me. But the gift of that then is I'm writing a first draft in about a month. So I can produce a lot more writing each year just because of the muscle memory and the time that I've put in this far. And I absolutely love this piece of writing. This is by far my favorite part of the process, is to just be deep in creating a new story. When we get farther along and we're talking about edits and copy edits and page proofs, which are the bane of my existence, it's not quite as fun. It's cool because you get to see the story like take shape and other people are touching it and it's getting better and all of those things. But to be in another world, like just letting myself run free and see where a story is going to lead me and still be surprised all the time. Like I talked about at the beginning, that's my sweet spot. If I could just live there forever, I'd be blissfully happy.
Right. Since you brought up time,
Mhm.
that is something that is interesting because word count is a priority. And so if you're focused on, starting out the day and getting to that word count, what are the things that don't get done? What are the things that get deprioritized for word count? Because there's more to being an author than just writing.
Yeah. I would say the thing is, word count is the one thing that I prioritize above all else. So I'm not responding to emails. Emails will sit in my inbox for days. If you're waiting for a response from me, darlings, it's just because like I'm deep in writing a new story and I will get to that when I have time. But word count is always my number one priority. It's my professional job. So I'm not like out for lunch and shopping and like doing other things in the world because I'm writing and it's my priority. But yeah, I would say word count because it is my top priority. Everything else that I have to do falls to the bottom of the list. So then when I'm done with word count at the end of the day, when I hit 3,000 words, and maybe let's say I hit that by like 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, maybe I hit it by noon. It does take a lot of energy to be in that creative space. So then sometimes I have to like prioritize, okay, like, all right, for the next 3 or 4 hours left of my workday, what do I have to get done? Usually that's some sort of like copy edit or page proof or that piece of the puzzle that has to take secondary priority because those are goals and deadlines that are predetermined by the publishing houses. But yeah, social media, like all the other things fall to the bottom of the list. And sometimes that can be a problem too, because it's like, okay, I have to finish a book. Shoot, when am I going to bake a recipe for the next bake shop or test something in the kitchen?
Or I have 3 books coming out in the next 2 months. How do I put together marketing plans and execute them for all 3 books?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. We were just having this conversation the other night.
Exactly. Not that I'm speaking from experience or anything, but
Yeah.
okay. So you just listed off a bunch of things though that get pushed down on the priority list. Like break those down in terms of like what, because you said for you, right
Hmm.
now for a genre and a series that you're familiar with, you can write a first draft in a month. So we know it takes about a month to write a first draft. How much time do those other steps take? Like the other steps in the process of, a book?
Yeah. Well, I would say for me, editing a book now usually takes a good solid 2 weeks for the first pass because I really have to do a deeper dive. I tend to write smaller first drafts, 50 to 60,000 words. So my first editing pass is layering in all kinds of detail. And I always think that part is going to go faster because I think, oh, I'm going to do a read through. I'll make notes in the margin. I always keep a notebook next to me of things that I know I'm going to change once I come back to a book. And inevitably, it always takes so much longer. I think, oh, I'm going to edit. I'm going to use that same word count time and I'm going to edit 10 chapters today. But I usually can only get 2 to 3 chapters edited at a time. So usually that's 2 to 3 weeks of editing. And then depending on the publishing house, one of my publishers, we do a lot more collaboration. So I'll send my editor really a glorified second draft that's been worked through, and then she'll come in and do a developmental edit and send me a big letter. So that one I don't touch as much. With my other publishing house, I'm sending them a really pretty polished, usually third draft. So that gets another touch. And again, the editing and anything in that line gets top priority over then responding to email, doing dishes, laundry, grocery shopping, like anything else.
For the lay darlings out there, I've got your back. Don't worry. Speaking as a non-writer, so you mentioned your first draft mean 50 to 60,000 ish words, and then
Yeah.
you start the layering process. Tell everybody, like a typical, like let's say 300-page book, what final copy, how many total words would that be around?
Around 70,000, somewhere between like high 60s to mid 70s. 80,000 is probably the top end of that. But yeah, I would say like 70 is a good goal as
Okay.
a finished book.
But still, you're talking about the editing layering process having to add 10 to 20,000 words.
Right.
In addition to making up for all the words that you cut from
Yep.
the draft, right? So yeah, so
Exactly.
that it is a significant amount of work. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So what comes next and how long does it take?
Then you have all of the, let's say the book then has gone through all these editing stages. I've worked with my publishing team. Then you have the marketing of the book, the early marketing, the getting readers just to know that you have another book coming out, responding to reviews, like all of that piece. And then there's also like going out on tour or doing things once the book releases to get readers excited about a new book, which is not a small task.
No, it is not. It is sometimes very, very difficult. It is fun, and it is another part of the creative process in terms of having, coming up with new ways because it gets, you can't just say, here's a picture of my book, here's a picture of my book, here's a picture
Yeah.
of my book. It's always coming up with creative ways to introduce new books to people and then dealing with the frustration of, a lot of work going into the marketing campaign for a book and having, social media following and everything and seeing just a small fraction of your following actually see the marketing campaign that you put together.
Yes, I know, which is I'm so lucky because we're a team in that, and a lot of writer friends are doing that solo.
Yeah.
And you can't discount the hours that we personally spend promoting and marketing all of the books in the series is at least equal to the amount of time I spend writing.
I do want to back up to cover one topic that I think is you talk a lot about again in your course and with your coaching students and everything, and that's research.
Yeah.
I know you put a ton of research into every book you write, but especially when you're starting a new series or spinoff, like with the novel detectives and everything. I know because we do a lot of traveling
Yeah.
for this research. So
Because you're part of it, whether you want to be or not.
yeah, there is a lot of work that goes into that. So talk a little bit about that and its importance, and then just the time it takes.
Yeah, that's another huge chunk of time. It depends on sort of where I am. Sometimes that research happens ahead of writing the first draft. Sometimes it happens in between writing the first draft and then starting on edits because as I've talked about extensively on this podcast and in other places as well, you need time away from that first draft to be able to come back to it with fresh eyes. One of the great things for me was because right out of the gate, I was writing multiple series. I kind of had to force myself to switch gears and I'd be writing Bake Shop and then I'd go and I'd write a Meg. And so I'd have time away from the Bake Shop and then I could come back to it with fresh eyes. So I often encourage new writers to use that time after they've finished a first draft. Now is a great time to do a deeper dive into research. If you're, setting your book in, I don't know, the southern Florida coastline or something, like go to the coast then, like see how it smells, all those things. For me, I don't have to do as much research for an established series, but when I'm working on a new series, when I'm tiptoeing into a different genre, there's a lot more time and effort that needs to go into world building, character development, making sure I'm getting the sensory details right, plotting, all of those things. So that is probably a good week or two of time just in and of itself and being really immersed into creating those worlds. And that can look very different depending on what the series is. Maybe for you and I, it's like a trip for a long weekend to Half Moon Bay and we're having a great time and we're enjoying it, but I'm also stopping every 5 minutes to take pictures of everything and notes and like little videos of how things smell. And so yeah, it's a getaway, but it's also always work then too. Good work, but work.
It is work. It definitely is. And it's always top of mind too whenever we are on a research trip. Even when we are having fun, I think you and I are always kind of laser focused on this is what you're talking about in the book, or this would be great to include in the next book, or
Yeah.
oh my gosh, look at this place. This has got to be part of a setting later or whatever it is. I will say though that I don't think you give yourself enough credit because you did talk about the amount of work that goes into research for things that are new to you. And you don't have to do as much for things that are familiar, like the Bake Shop mysteries. But the one thing I will say is I see the amount of work that goes into like the Bake Shop mysteries. And even if that writing those characters is new to you, the one thing I will say is the incorporation of food
Yeah.
and the baking process and everything is so detailed. And even if it's just a recipe that you're including that Jules and the team at Tort might be baking in a particular book, you kind of do a deep dive on that if it's not something that you're very familiar with, and you do become familiar with it. So there is, I think, research even for the familiar stuff as well.
No, that's true. And I do also try to keep up on food trends and baking trends. And I'm always on the hunt for new tips that I can weave in that Jules might be passing on to like one of the young bakers in the bake shop for sure. There's always some level of research, but there's just definitely a lot more time that you have to spend if you're building out a brand new world. So I now have to take that into account with my writing schedule because yes, I'm writing 3,000
Mhm.
words a day and I can write a first draft in a month or so. But then I have to think like, oh, okay. And this just happened this year where I thought I was going to write two new cozy rom-coms and I realized, no, I need a lot more time for this because I am building a new world. It's a new setting, it's a new set of characters, it's a different genre. I've written a couple, but I don't have the same cellular memory that I do for murder at this point in time. Um, so I had to reach out to my editor and say, hey, we got to change the schedule around. I can do one this year. Let's push the other back to next year because of just that. The time that I require is going to be a lot more than it might be if I was writing something that I was really familiar with. Yeah, I would say the last thing that I would add to my list that I do all year round, and that technically is work, it doesn't feel like work, and it's also one of the best parts of work, is reading. I am constantly reading. I think you should be reading in the genre you want to write in extensively because you're learning the craft, you're learning what's working in the genre, you're picking up on the market. Those are also going to be future authors that you can network with. You're building your writer IQ this way. You should also be reading in genres that you might want to write in the future. So for me, I'm constantly reading mysteries, but I'm reading a lot of other things too. And then I'm just reading for fun and for pleasure. But even when I'm reading for fun or for pleasure, there's work going on in my subconscious in the back of my brain. I think that is a mandatory piece of being a writer. You have to read and read a lot.
It's funny when you said it's work, but it doesn't really feel like work. That's totally true. I think a lot of people out there, writers and readers, can relate that if you're going to have to work, reading great books is, it
Right.
doesn't seem like that bad of a thing. I kind of laughed when you said that because it immediately reminded me of Sky Guy and his running. For the darlings out there who don't know, our son was a cross country runner from elementary school all the way through college. And he had a shirt at a couple of different schools. He had a shirt that said, "My sport is your sport's punishment."
That's
And
right.
that just made me think of that, as a writer, your work is going to be reading, and that is such cool work.
Exactly. We need a t-shirt. My work is your pleasure or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah, exactly. It's just something. There's something there. We'll have to think about
Hmm.
that. It probably needs to use a bad pun too.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure. Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
All right. Lots of learnings there. Very cool stuff.
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed it, darlings. And as always, hit us up if you have any other questions in the comments. I believe you can even leave us a voicemail.
Yeah, send us a message. The link's right there in the show notes. We'd love to hear from you. And with that, I will say until next time.
Till next time.